In the late summer of 1919, in the foothills of Montana's Bitterroot Valley, Arthur Jensen was digging a moat around his house. At least that's what it looked like. To every rider who passed on the county road, to every neighbor who slowed their wagon to get a better look, the sight was baffling. Arthur, a quiet man of 35 who had arrived with his family the previous year, was methodically excavating a trench. It was 3 feet wide and a full 5 feet deep, circling the entire stone foundation of his modest cabin. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm that seemed to ignore the coming autumn. The valley thought he'd lost his mind. They said it at the trading post. They whispered it after church. A trench that deep, that close to the house? It was an invitation for disaster. It would collect water, undermine the foundation, and turn his cellar into a frozen swamp come winter. It was the act of a fool, or a man with too much time on his hands. And when the winter of 1920 hit, followed by the most catastrophic spring thaw in a generation, that crazy ditch would prove the difference between a sound home and a broken one. If you want to see the number that made the most respected builder in the valley go silent, stay until the end. What did this former Army engineer understand about soil and water that every seasoned frontiersman in the valley had missed? Let's hit subscribe and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Arthur Jensen wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 35-year-old veteran, trying to keep his family's home from slowly breaking apart. He'd spent 4 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, not in the trenches of France, but in the forgotten corners of the war effort. He'd built supply roads in the waterlogged soil of the South and laid foundations for signal towers in the Alaskan Territory, where the ground itself was a fickle, moving enemy. He'd learned a fundamental truth that had been drilled into him by sergeants and bitter experience: water always wins. You don't fight it, you don't block it. You give it an easier place to go. When he and his wife Eleanor had bought their parcel of land, the cabin on it was more than respectable by frontier standards. It was built of solid pine logs, well chinked, with a fieldstone foundation laid by a man who knew his craft. It had a dry cellar and floors that were mostly level. For their first few months through the fall and into the early winter, it was a fine home. Arthur felt he'd made a good choice. A solid place to raise their 2 young daughters. Then came their first Montana spring. It was a lesson in brutal physics. The winter had been cold, driving the frost line down nearly 4 feet into the valley's clay-heavy soil. Then, in late March, the thaw came not as a gentle melt, but as a violent, week-long event. The snowpack vanished, saturating the frozen ground from above, while the deep frost held firm below. The land turned into a quagmire, and inside the cabin, a slow-motion disaster began. It started with sounds: a low groan from the floorboards in the middle of the night, the sharp crack of a settling log that sounded like a rifle shot. Then the doors began to stick. First the bedroom door, then the front door, until it took a firm shoulder to get it open. Eleanor found a new crack in the plaster near the hearth, a jagged line that grew a little longer each day. The real problem was in the cellar. The stone walls, once dry, began to weep. Puddles formed on the dirt floor. A damp, musty smell crept up into the living space. Arthur went down to investigate and saw it immediately. The north-facing foundation wall had a hairline fracture running through 3 of the large granite stones. On the floor, directly below it, the earth had bulged upward. He knew exactly what was happening. Frost heave. The immense volume of water in the soil around his foundation had frozen solid during the winter, expanding with incredible force, lifting and pushing the stone walls. Now, as the thaw progressed, the ground was softening unevenly. The foundation was settling back down, but not at the same rate. The strain was immense. The house was, in essence, being twisted on its base. His neighbors told him it was normal. "Happens every spring," said a man at the trading post. "You just learn to live with it. Jack up the low corner in May, re-chink the logs in June, and hope for a dry summer." They talked about it like the seasons, an unavoidable cycle of damage and repair. For them, a house was not a static object, but a thing in constant, slow-motion conflict with the land. That thought nagged at Arthur. In the core, you didn't learn to live with a failing bridge abutment or a sinking runway. You identified the fundamental problem and engineered a permanent solution. The problem wasn't the house, it wasn't the foundation. It was the water in the soil next to the foundation. As long as that soil could become saturated, it would freeze, expand, and break whatever stood in its way. The pressure wasn't just a few pounds. Saturated, freezing soil could exert forces of over 20,000 pounds per square foot. No stone wall, no matter how well built, could withstand that kind of power year after year. One evening in April, watching Eleanor struggle to force their front door shut against the warped frame, his plan formed. It was simple. He wasn't going to try to make his foundation stronger. He was going to make the ground around it weaker, or rather, incapable of transmitting that force. He was going to keep the soil beneath his home permanently dry. He would dig a deep trench, a perimeter drain, and give the groundwater an escape route before it ever reached the critical zone under his footings. He would create a barrier, not of stone or steel, but of empty space and drainage. His plan was to tell the water where to go. The opportunity came that July. The county was replacing a dozen old timber culverts on the main road, and the old, weathered 6-inch clay drainage tiles were being piled up for scrap. Arthur spoke to the foreman and bought the entire lot, nearly 200 feet of pipe, for $5. The rest of his materials were free, requiring only labor. Over the next 6 weeks, he would become a spectacle, and so the digging began. He started at the highest corner of his property, marking out a line that would circle the house and then run 100 yards downhill to a small, marshy patch of land. This was his outfall, the lowest point where the water could escape. Then he started the trench around the cabin. He worked with a pickaxe and a spade. The sun beat down. The work was grueling, monotonous. First, he stripped the topsoil and set it aside. Then he got into the dense, rocky clay that made up the valley floor. Every shovelful was a battle. Rocks had to be pried out with a steel bar. He was moving cubic yards of earth by hand, one scoop at a time. His daughters would bring him water, their eyes wide at the canyon he was creating around their home. Eleanor watched from the porch, a quiet anxiety in her posture. She trusted Arthur's competence. She'd seen him fix machines and solve problems that baffled other men. But this was different. This was public. She could feel the eyes of their neighbors as they passed. She heard the change in tone when she went to the general store. The friendly questions about their garden were replaced with hesitant, almost pitying inquiries. "That's quite a project Arthur's taken on," the storekeeper's wife said, not meeting her eye. After 2 weeks of digging, the trench was complete. It was a raw, earthen scar around their tidy cabin. It looked, as one neighbor later remarked, like he'd started to dig a new cellar and forgot to stop. Now here's what made this actually brilliant. Arthur wasn't just digging a ditch to hold water. He was building a system. He started at the bottom of the trench, which he'd sloped meticulously, a 1-inch drop for every 8 feet of run, ensuring gravity would do all the work. On the floor of the trench, he laid a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel, which he hauled by wagon load from a nearby creek bed. This was a brutal, back-breaking part of the job. 24 trips, shoveling tons of rock by hand, first into the wagon, then out of it. This gravel bed would act as a filter and a channel. On top of the gravel, he carefully laid the old clay drainage tiles end to end. He didn't seal the joints. He left a small quarter-inch gap between each section. This was critical. These gaps were where the water would enter the pipe. He wasn't trying to build a waterproof sewer line. He was building a sieve. The purpose of the pipe was not to keep water out, but to let it in and carry it away. Once the pipe was laid, he began filling the rest of the trench, not with the dense clay he'd excavated, but with more creek gravel. He filled it right up to within a foot of the surface. This column of loose gravel was the heart of the whole system. Dense clay soil can hold a tremendous amount of water through capillary action, like a sponge. Gravel can't. Water passes right through it. He was effectively replacing the spongy, expansive soil around his foundation with a dry, stable, non-expansive material. It was like the dead air in a double-pane window. He was creating a buffer zone, a curtain of drainage that would intercept any subsurface water moving toward his house and shuttle it harmlessly into the pipe at the bottom. He interrupted this technical work for human moments. One afternoon, as he was wrestling a large rock from the trench wall, Eleanor came out. "Arthur," she said, her voice quiet. "Mr. Croft is here." Silas Croft was the man who had built half the foundations in the valley, including, years ago, the one Arthur was now dissecting. He was a master stonemason, a man whose work was his identity. He stood at the edge of the trench, arms crossed, a look of profound disbelief on his face. Arthur climbed out, wiping sweat from his brow. "Silas?" he nodded. "Jensen?" Croft said, his voice gravelly. "Mind telling me what in God's name you're doing to my foundation?" Arthur kept his explanation simple. "Trying to keep the soil underneath it dry." Croft scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "By digging a ditch to catch every drop of rain and snowmelt, you're inviting water to pool right against the stone. It'll seep through the mortar, freeze in the winter, and turn my work to rubble. You're building a cistern, not a drain." This was the core technical objection, and it sounded reasonable, but it was based on a misunderstanding of the physics. "The water won't pool, Silas," Arthur said calmly. "It'll have somewhere to go." He pointed down the long trench leading away from the house. Croft just shook his head, his professional identity clearly challenged. "You're a fool. You're going to destroy a perfectly good house. Don't come crying to me next spring when your cellar's a lake and your walls are cracked to hell." He turned and walked back to his wagon without another word. Arthur just watched him go, then climbed back into the trench. Finally, he placed a layer of straw over the gravel to prevent the topsoil from silting up the drain, and then replaced the dark, rich topsoil he'd first removed. He graded it carefully away from the house. When he was finished, the only visible sign of the massive undertaking was a slightly raised, 3-foot-wide band of earth circling his home. From the outside, it didn't look like a barn had eaten a house. It looked normal. But beneath the surface, the entire hydrology of his property had been fundamentally altered. Total cost, in cash, $5 for the pipes. The rest was paid in sweat. That evening, Eleanor looked out at the finished work. The yard was tidy again. The ugly scar was gone, but her anxiety remained. "Arthur," she said softly, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." Arthur put his arm around her. "Let them," he said. The ridicule, which had been a low murmur, started in earnest after Silas Croft's visit. The story spread. The expert had condemned the project. Now, everyone felt licensed to mock. At the trading post, a tough, loud-mouthed rancher named Ben Carter got the biggest laugh. Arthur was there buying salt and flour when Carter bellowed across the room, "Hey, Jensen, heard you're digging your own grave around that cabin. Smart move, saves your family the trouble later." The room erupted in laughter. Arthur just paid for his goods, nodded to the storekeeper, and left. He never argued. He never explained. He just continued his work. The community gossip network was in full swing. At the quilting circle, the women would speak in hushed, sympathetic tones to Eleanor. "It must be so hard, dear," one said, "with your husband having notions." The conversations would go quiet when she entered a room. They weren't being cruel, not intentionally. They saw her as the victim of her husband's strange obsession. Their pity was, in some ways, harder to bear than outright mockery. Then came the institutional skeptic, a young man from the county extension office, fresh out of agricultural college in Bozeman, stopped by. His name was Philip Hayes. He carried a clipboard and had an air of book-learned certainty. "Mr. Jensen," he began after a tour of the now invisible system, "I've checked every bulletin from the Department of Agriculture. There's no approved method for foundation drainage like this. The standard practice is to grade the surface and use dense, compacted clay backfill to shed water. What you've done, well, it's unorthodox. It's not in any manual I've seen." "The manuals are for farming," Arthur replied evenly. "I'm not trying to grow crops. I'm trying to keep my house from breaking." Hayes made some notes. "I'll have to file a report noting the non-standard construction. I can't officially approve it." "I'm not asking for your approval," Arthur said. "I'm just trying something different." But the cut that went deepest came from family. Eleanor's brother, Tom, came for Sunday dinner in October. He was a practical man, a carpenter who did things by the book. He cornered Arthur in the barn after the meal. "Arthur, I'm saying this because I care about Eleanor and the girls," he started, his voice laced with genuine concern. "People are talking. They don't see an engineer trying something new. They see a man who spent his whole summer on a useless ditch while he could have been putting up more firewood or expanding the barn. They're going to think you're either scared of the work that matters or you're incompetent. Maybe both." This was the core of the community's judgment. He had violated a social norm. He had wasted time on an invisible, theoretical problem when there was so much visible, practical work to be done. Arthur looked at his brother-in-law, his face calm. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Tom. I'm trying to keep my family's home on a solid foundation." By the first snowfall in November, not one person in the valley, apart from perhaps Eleanor, thought Arthur Jensen had solved anything. They thought he'd built an underground monument to his own foolishness. The winter that followed would be the judge. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Arthur right. It changed how people in that valley thought about building itself. Then November came. And it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1920 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It wasn't just a single blizzard. It was a relentless, sustained siege of Arctic air. The temperatures began to fall, and they didn't stop. December 8th, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. December 12th, minus 31. On Christmas Eve, the official reading at the county seat was minus 38 degrees, with wind chills that the old-timers swore were colder than anything they'd ever felt. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer never climbed above zero. The frost line, which normally stopped at 3 or 4 feet, drove down past 5. The very earth was frozen solid to a depth unseen in decades. Then, in late February, the pattern broke with a shocking violence. A warm, wet system moved in from the Pacific. The temperature swung 50 degrees in less than 48 hours. Rain began to fall. Not snow, not sleet, but a hard, steady rain falling on 5 feet of frozen ground. It was the perfect recipe for a catastrophic thaw. The rain couldn't soak in. It pooled, it ran, and it found every crack and crevice, pouring water into the top layer of soil while the deep frost remained a solid, impermeable block of ice below. The hydrostatic pressure building in the ground was staggering, and the valley began to break. The sounds started first. In homes all across the county, people were jolted awake by sharp, percussive cracks. It was the sound of foundation stones shifting under unbearable loads. It was the groan of massive support beams twisting. Silas Croft, the master stonemason, was at the Colby Ranch when their brand new spring house foundation failed. He'd laid it himself the previous summer, a massive granite block, a cornerstone weighing nearly a ton, cracked clean in two with a sound like a cannon shot. The building sagged precariously. Silas stared at it, his face ashen. It was his work. It was perfect, and the ground had broken it as if it were a piece of pottery. At the Miller farm, their front door jammed shut so tightly they had to use the kitchen door for a week. When they finally got it open, they saw why. The entire front sill of the house had heaved upward by 3 inches, bowing the doorframe into a parallelogram. At Ben Carter's place, the man who had mocked Arthur at the trading post, the situation was worse. The back wall of his cellar collapsed inward, a slurry of mud and freezing water pouring in, ruining a winter's worth of preserved food. He and his son spent 2 days in the frigid muck, trying to shore up the wall before the whole house came down. Everywhere, the story was the same. Cracks appeared in plaster, windows refused to open, floors developed unsettling slopes. It was the shared misery of every previous spring, but magnified tenfold. This wasn't just the usual settling, this was structural failure on a community-wide scale. And then people started noticing the Jensen place. Arthur was seen outside in his shirt sleeves, calmly splitting his next season's firewood. He wasn't frantically jacking up a corner of his house. He wasn't desperately re-chinking logs that had pulled apart. His front door opened and closed smoothly. From the road, his cabin looked exactly as it had the previous fall. It was an island of unnerving calm in a sea of slow-motion destruction. The absence of disaster was more conspicuous than any dramatic event. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It provided irrefutable proof of a principle they had ignored for generations. On the 3rd day of the thaw, with rain still falling, a wagon pulled into Arthur Jensen's yard. It was Silas Croft. He wasn't there to gloat or to say, "I told you so." He looked tired and defeated. He climbed down slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin, looking for the telltale signs of strain he was seeing everywhere else. He saw none. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock. The door didn't stick. It didn't scrape. It swung open silently, perfectly. "Silas," she said, her voice even. She showed no surprise at his visit. This was her moment of agency. She had endured the pity and the whispers, and now the chief critic stood on her porch. She didn't need to say a word. The smoothly swinging door said everything. "Eleanor," he grunted, "everything all right here? I'm checking on some of the foundations in the area." It was a pretense, and they both knew it. "We're fine, Silas. We're managing just fine," she replied, stepping back. "Come in, if you like." Behind her, through the cabin opening, Croft saw the girls at the table drawing on pieces of paper. The floor they sat on was level. The walls behind them were seamless. There were no new cracks in the plaster. But the real proof was in the cellar. "Your cellar," Silas said, his voice low. "Can I see it?" Arthur had come in from the back. He just nodded. "This way." Arthur led him to the cellar door. It too opened without a catch. He lit a lantern. The stone steps were dry. As they descended, the air was cool, but it was a clean, dry cool. It smelled of earth and stored apples, not of mold and damp. The lantern light revealed a miracle. The stone walls were bone dry. The dirt floor was firm and dusty. There were no puddles, no dark, damp patches, no weeping mortar joints, It was as if the catastrophic thaw happening just a few feet away simply didn't exist down here. Silas ran his hand over the foundation wall he had condemned. His calloused fingers, which could read the texture of stone like a blind man reads Braille, felt nothing but dry, solid granite. He walked the perimeter, his lantern held high, searching for a single drop of moisture, a single hairline fracture. He found nothing. It was impossible. He knew for a fact that the ground outside this wall was a super-saturated, freezing, heaving mess. But in here it was stable and dry. He turned to Arthur, his face a mask of confusion. How? Arthur didn't give a long speech. He just pointed to the ceiling. The ground under this floor is dry, has been all winter. The trench is doing its job. Silas was still struggling to comprehend it. It should have heaved. The frost is 5 feet deep. Nothing stops that. Dry soil doesn't heave, Arthur said simply. There's no water in it to expand. This was the moment for the irrefutable number. Arthur led Silas back outside to the north corner of the cabin. There, hammered into the ground just 6 inches from the foundation, was a small wooden stake with a red line painted on it, level with the bottom of the foundation stones. About 20 feet away, out in the yard, was an identical stake. The difference was staggering. The stake out in the yard had been pushed up out of the ground. A gap of dark, wet earth was visible beneath its red line. The top of the stake was clearly several inches higher than the base of the foundation. The stake right next to the cabin, however, hadn't moved. Its red line was still perfectly flush with the bottom of the stonework. Silas stared, his mind working. He walked back to his wagon and returned with his own tools, a long spirit level and a measuring rule. He was a man who trusted only his own instruments. He placed the level, one end resting on the base of the foundation, the other sitting on top of the distant stake. The bubble shot to one side. He measured the difference. The number was 4.5 inches. Let that sink in for a moment. The ground just 20 feet away from the cabin had swelled upward by 4.5 inches. The ground directly under the cabin had not moved a single millimeter. Silas measured it 3 times. He checked his level. He stared at the 2 stakes, then back at the perfectly plumb, uncracked foundation wall. He looked at the smoothly closed front door. He looked at Arthur Jensen. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. Arthur hadn't just reduced the problem, he had eliminated it. He hadn't fought the water. He had, as he planned, simply told it where to go. And it had obeyed. Finally, Silas Croft, the valley's foremost expert on stone and foundations, a man whose professional pride was the bedrock of his character, lowered his measuring rule. He looked Arthur square in the eye. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "I've been laying stone for 40 years, he said. 40 years. And all that time I've been fighting the water. You just gave it a better path." He shook his head slowly. "We've been doing this wrong for 70 years. That was the vindication. Not a shout, but a quiet admission of profound error from the one man whose opinion mattered most. It wasn't just about a dry cellar. It was about dignity. Arthur's children did their schoolwork without the floor shifting beneath them. Eleanor cooked in a kitchen where the windows opened and the doors closed. They slept through the night without being woken by the groans of a house in pain. The system didn't just save the house from damage. It turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. Word of Silas Croft's visit and his verdict spread through the valley faster than a grass fire. The mockery stopped overnight. It was replaced by a grudging, then open, respect. A few days later, Philip Hayes, the young extension agent, returned. This time he didn't have his clipboard. He had a set of survey equipment. He spent 2 hours with Arthur, taking precise measurements of the heave, documenting the condition of the cellar, and sketching the design of the drainage system. He was no longer an inspector, he was a student. Arthur had kept meticulous records through the winter, a habit from the Army. He had dates, temperature readings, and notes on the condition of the house. This wasn't luck, it was data. And the data was undeniable. By the time the ground had fully thawed in April, half the valley knew something impossible was happening at the Jensen place, and they wanted to know how. The first convert was a man named George Miller, whose front door was still jammed. He was a practical, hard-working farmer who cared more about results than reputation. He came to Arthur, hat in hand, not with an apology, but with a simple question. "Will you show me how you did it?" Arthur spent a Saturday with him, walking his property, explaining the principles of slope and drainage. Miller didn't have access to clay pipes, so Arthur showed him how to create a crude but effective substitute. A channel made of flat stones leaned against each other to form a triangular culvert at the bottom of the trench. It was a simpler variation, but the principle was the same. That summer, George Miller and his sons dug their own trench. The following spring, for the first time in the 30 years they'd lived in that house, their front door opened smoothly. The idea began to spread. It wasn't a rush, but a slow, steady adoption by the most practical men in the valley. 7 families dug drains that first summer, 12 more the next. Within 5 years, nearly every home in the lower valley had a dark ring of earth around it, the telltale sign of a Jensen drain. They became a status symbol, a mark of a forward-thinking owner. Philip Hayes, the extension agent, did more than just take notes. He wrote a formal bulletin, published by the state's agricultural college. It was titled Subsurface Drainage for Rural Foundations in High Frost Regions. It was filled with diagrams, soil analysis, and temperature data from the winter of 1920. It never mentioned Arthur Jensen by name, referring only to a prototype system installed in the Bitterroot Valley. But everyone knew. The bulletin was passed from county to county, and the simple, effective technique began to appear all across the northern states. What Arthur Jensen built in 1919 using scrap pipe and creek gravel anticipated by nearly half a century what building scientists would later formalize as a curtain drain or a French drain foundation. He wasn't an inventor. The principles were as old as the Romans, but he was the first person in that valley to see how knowledge from one domain, military engineering in unstable soils, could solve a problem everyone else had accepted as a permanent fact of life. Years later, when his own daughters were grown, one of them asked him if he ever felt angry about the mockery he'd endured that first year. Arthur, now a respected elder in the community, just shook his head. "I wasn't trying to impress anyone," he said, echoing the same words he'd told his brother-in-law years before. "This isn't new. It's just correct." The cabin still stands today, its foundation as solid and uncracked as the day it was built. It survived floods, droughts, and the brutal winters that followed. It stands as a quiet monument to a simple idea, that the frontier didn't ultimately reward stubbornness or tradition. It rewarded what worked. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's the biggest home repair challenge you've ever faced? Subscribe for one proven frontier technique every week. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering techniques. The specific characters, names, and locations are fictional, but the methods are based on real historical practices and the timeless principles of physics and hydrology.